If you've ever wondered how you can find more of those coveted brilliant moves on chess.com, this is the video for you. We're going to talk about both studying and in-game thought process tips that will help you find more of these amazing moves that you can brag about to all of your friends. And I'm also going to show you in real time my thought process during a game when I have found some of these brilliant moves myself. So first of all, it's helpful to know what exactly a brilliant move is. And according to chess.com, a brilliant move is just very simply a good piece sacrifice. But of course there are more stipulations because every time you sacrifice a piece, you're not going to get a brilliant move. It is always the best or nearly the best move in the position. And the additional stipulations are that you should not be in a bad position after a brilliant move, and you should not be completely winning even if you hadn't found the move. So if every single move is winning, they're not going to give you a brilliant because it's just well, you're just up 7 queens. And whether or not you get one of these brilliant moves in the game review actually does depend on your rating. So what would be considered a brilliant move for a newer player would not be considered the same thing for a higher rated player because it's more expected that the higher rated player would find a simpler piece sacrifice. But the problem is if you're constantly just looking for piece sacrifices, they're not always going to work. And so you have to be aware of the kinds of positions that are kind of ripe for these kinds of sacrifices and then be able to calculate all the way to the end to make sure your move actually works. So if you want to be able to find more of these moves and also just get better at finding good moves in general, rule number 1 is that you need to look for every single check in the position. And the more you practice this, the better you will get at it. I think a lot of times these kind of brilliant sacrifices can be kind of a blind spot for a lot of beginner and intermediate players just because you are so focused in on equalizing or getting better material over anything rather than looking for checkmate or calculating a full sequence where you sacrifice a piece, but then you get more material in the end, things like that. But initially, the want to sacrifice a piece is not always there, and it's not always something that you would think of right away. And so how do you get better at this? You have to do a lot of puzzles. A lot of times in things like Puzzle Rush, you will get a lot of these piece sacrificing ideas, and once you kind of get those ideas floating through your head, they're going to be a lot easier to spot in games just because the pattern is already kind of ingrained in your mind. But how do you know if a position is ripe for a sacrifice? Because a lot of times in quiet positions, that doesn't even come into my mind that there might be some kind of a brilliant idea here. And generally the idea is that there is either a messy position where there's a lot of piece tension, a lot of things that could be captured on the next move, a lot of pieces that are looking at each other, or kings are in danger. And that's exactly what's happening in the position on the board in front of us. So I'm actually going to show you from a recent stream and talk you through my thought process. I kind of talk about it out loud, but I'll react to it. So there will be 2 Kamryns on the screen. So you can see exactly when, the moment I spot the actual sacrificing idea, and then what happens next as far as my thought process. All right, we gotta focus. I'm down so much on time and pawns. I mean, right? Okay. So immediately the idea of sacking my rook comes to mind, right? I have 2 pieces on it. I know that if I sacrifice on g5 and Black captures back with the pawn, I can then take with the queen, and as you'll see with my arrows, the king will move over and my rook will swing to h4 for mate. Okay, that is the obvious idea. And so now the thing is that I need to calculate all the way to the end to make sure that Black doesn't have any other options, and as you'll see, I will come to find out that Black actually doesn't have to capture the rook back. Okay, what am I missing? Sitting on my hands, basically, not just playing the sacrifice. I think it's all forced. He can't block. What if he doesn't take the rook and just goes to h8, maybe? Yes. So this is the other thing. You can't always assume that your opponent is going to play directly into your evil plan. And that is how a sacrifice that you think is brilliant might become one that is not actually so brilliant. Then I just win my pawn back, I guess. Yeah, so then I've figured out, I've lost a pawn in this position. But I've realized that if I play the rook sacrifice, my opponent captures back, I know I'm going to win that position, so then I need to calculate the other things that my opponent could do Luckily, when you play something that is a check, it cuts down on the amount of options that your opponent can play, and you're often able to calculate like all the way to the end of the lines that are basically forced. So my opponent could go to h7 or h8, and I just needed to make sure that I wasn't going to be like losing any material at the end of this, or that my opponent didn't have a follow-up check. And once I saw that they didn't, I was at least going to be winning a pawn back. I had opened up their king. It seemed like a great sacrifice to me. So we played it. So the second one I wanted to show you took me a little bit longer to find. So this is one of those messy positions. There's obviously a lot of pieces on the board. My opponent's king is out in the middle of nowhere. So going back to that idea of like king safety, there are a lot of checks in the position that I was considering. And a lot of times brilliant moves involve you having to like change the plan that you had initially come up with. And again, look for every single check. So we will see how this turns out and how long it takes me to spot the correct move. Hopefully you can spot it faster than I did. Okay, interesting. Just check, right? Or here. Any blocks? Can't tell if I have anything. Oh, I have this. So this is kind of the moment, right? I'm going through all of the checks that I potentially have. And then I kind of go past like the obvious ones, which is the queen check. I'd been kind of maneuvering my queen all over the place to force my opponent's king out into closer to the center of the board. So obviously like following up with more queen checks is kind of what you have a tendency to do. But if you are able to train yourself to expand your list of candidate moves, this is how you find ideas like knight d5 check. Wait. Yeah, I just have that. What are these called? Superfluous knights? And I get this knight. So going back again, looking at this knight d5 move, it is forced, right? It's a check, and if my opponent moves their king anywhere, the knight is still forking the queen and the king, and so the queen would be captured. But after the pawn captures back, which is like the only other move to prevent that initial fork from happening, the other knight comes in, and it's still a fork. Just knowing these kinds of ideas, again, it comes out of a lot of experience and a lot of practice with puzzles, because you will start to see the patterns. When you have a queen and a king, or just two valuable pieces on squares that are exactly diagonal to each other, that is a prime forkable position for a knight. So if you have knights in the vicinity, that's the kind of candidate moves you should potentially be thinking about. And, you know, the way that you set up these kinds of brilliant sacrifices is by maneuvering your pieces into active places that will allow for these kinds of positions to come about. And reiterating again, like not stopping at the obvious moves, the obvious checks. Like I wanted to initially to continue checking with my queen on h4 or on h8, but after those didn't give me anything very exciting, like I could see that my opponent was just going to escape, kind of expanding their horizons and seeing, okay, are there any other potential moves in the position? Bang, then we found the knight check. So I hope these ideas will help you to refine your thought process and find even more brilliant moves in your own games. Thanks so much for watching. If you're new around here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me out a lot, and I will see you soon.